something bad might be happening with lunar reactions in Genshin Impact. When Nod-Krai first introduced lunar reactions, a lot of players were excited. A new region mechanic, new elemental interactions, new team possibilities. That's usually a good thing for Genshin's combat system because every region tends to add its own twist. Fontaine had Ousia and Pneuma. Natlan introduced Nightsoul mechanics. These systems usually expand the sandbox a bit. But lunar reactions feel different. Not because they're weak. Not because they're complicated, but because of who can actually use them. And the moment players started realizing how limited that access is, the discussion online exploded. At first glance, lunar reactions look like a normal extension of elemental combat. You apply the usual elements, combine them in certain ways, and you trigger a special lunar reaction. Lunar Charged, Lunar Bloom, Lunar Crystallize. The names sound like variations of things we already understand. But the important detail isn't the reaction itself, it's the trigger. Unlike regular reactions, lunar reactions aren't something every character can interact with. They're tied to very specific characters from Nod-Krai who have access to moon-related abilities. In other words, the reaction system exists, but only certain characters can actually activate it. And right now, those characters are almost entirely 5 stars, and that's where the controversy starts. Because if you think back to previous regions, Genshin usually handled regional mechanics very differently. Fontaine's Ousia and Pneuma system, for example, had multiple ways to interact with it. Even if you didn't pull the newest 5-star, you still had options. Characters like Lynette or the Hydro Traveler gave players at least some access to the mechanic. It wasn't mandatory for combat either. Ousia and Pneuma were mostly extra flavor. Nice to have, but not essential. Lunar reactions feel like they're trying to be something more important than that. Some enemies in Nod-Krai, especially things like Wild Hunt shields, actually react strongly to lunar damage. Lunar reactions can deal significantly more damage to those mechanics compared to normal elemental reactions, which means that suddenly, the ability to trigger lunar reactions isn't just a gimmick anymore. It's a gameplay advantage. And if that advantage is locked behind limited 5-star characters, that's where people start getting uncomfortable. One player put it pretty bluntly. They said, "Honestly, it would have been fine if 4 stars could do lunar reactions. Tying the entire mechanic to 5 stars only was the mistake." That comparison actually makes a lot of sense. Imagine if Nightsoul in Natlan had only worked for 5 stars, or if Ousia and Pneuma could only be triggered by limited characters. It would feel strange, right? Because regional mechanics in Genshin have traditionally been something the whole roster can interact with, at least to some degree. But lunar reactions break that pattern, and that's why the community discussion around them isn't really about the reactions themselves. It's about what they represent. One concern players keep bringing up is the precedent. Genshin is a gacha game, and everyone understands that new characters are supposed to be exciting. They need to sell banners. That's normal. But when an entire combat mechanic is effectively locked behind those banners, it starts raising a different question. What happens if this becomes the new design trend? Imagine a future region introducing a powerful new reaction, but the only characters who can trigger it are limited 5 stars. Or worse, what if the mechanic itself gets locked behind constellations? That's the slippery slope some players are worried about. Now, to be fair, not everyone agrees that lunar reactions are actually that important. Some players argue the opposite. They say the reactions themselves aren't the real source of damage for those characters. The lunar 5 stars often deal most of their damage directly through their talents, which are tagged as lunar damage anyway. In that interpretation, lunar reactions are basically just visual flair. One comment summed it up like this: "If lunar reactions were triggerable by every character in the game, practically nothing would change. They are that bad." That's a pretty strong take, but it highlights something interesting. If the reactions themselves aren't the main source of damage, then why lock them behind specific characters at all? And that's where another theory starts popping up in discussions. The Traveler. Because if there's one character who feels like they should eventually gain access to lunar mechanics, it's probably the Traveler. Lore-wise, the Traveler already has a strange relationship with Nod-Krai's moon powers. During the story, they briefly interacted with Moon Marrow, and even had part of their restrictions lifted by Columbina. That moment alone had huge lore implications. Some players believe that Scene might actually be setting up something for later. There's even speculation that the Traveler could eventually gain the ability to trigger lunar reactions as the Nod-Krai story progresses, similar to how the Pyro Traveler was unlocked later in Natlan's arc. If that happens, it would solve a lot of the accessibility concerns, because suddenly everyone would have at least one character capable of interacting with the system. And interestingly, this idea has become one of the most popular suggestions in the community. Some players specifically wanted Hydro Traveler to gain the ability to trigger lunar reactions, since Hydro is involved in the lunar reaction types. Others suggested splitting the reactions across multiple Traveler elements, so each element enables a different lunar interaction. Even people who dislike the current Traveler kits say it would still be a meaningful upgrade. As one player joked, "You know Hydro Traveler is bad when people are begging for lunar reactions just to make them usable." But there's another side to this discussion that's worth mentioning. Some players think the whole controversy might actually be intentional. Nod-Krai has a very clear distinction between Vision users and Moon Wheel users. Lore-wise, Moon Wheels don't follow the same rules as Visions, which could explain why lunar reactions are tied specifically to certain characters. If that's the case, then the mechanic might be designed more around world building than accessibility. In other words, the restriction might be the point. Whether that explanation makes the system better or worse is something the community still argues about. But from a gameplay perspective, the bigger question is still the same. How much of the game should be locked behind character ownership? Because Genshin has always walked a very careful line here. Yes, powerful characters exist. Yes, new mechanics usually favor new units. But historically, the game has tried to avoid completely locking systems behind limited banners. There's usually some kind of workaround, even if it's weaker. That's why lunar reactions feel like such a strange experiment. They might be harmless, they might become more accessible later, or they might represent the beginning of a new direction for regional mechanics. Right now, we simply don't know. But the discussion around them shows something really interesting about the Genshin community. Players aren't just thinking about the current patch. They're thinking about what this design choice could mean 2 years from now. Because if lunar reactions remain limited to a handful of 5 stars, then Nod-Krai might be the first region where a core combat mechanic is effectively locked behind the gacha system. And that would be a pretty big shift for how Genshin works. So now I'm curious what you think. Are lunar reactions actually a problem? Or are players overreacting to a mechanic that isn't even that important yet? Do you think the Traveler should eventually gain lunar reaction abilities? Or do you think these mechanics should stay tied to specific Moon Wheel characters for lore reasons? Let me know your thoughts in the comments, because this is one of those topics where the community seems really split right now. And if you enjoyed this kind of Genshin analysis, make sure to like the video and subscribe for more discussions like this in the future.